And now we receive our collaborator, Arnold August. Be welcome, Arnold.
It's a pleasure to be with you. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm fine. This is an important day, and I think we all are just attending and aware of this day and all the events.
Yes.
So, as we know, Donald Trump did not attend Joe Biden's inauguration as the 46th president of the United States. And now, latest reports say that he is in his home at Mar-a-Lago Resort in Florida. But apart from this gesture, this childish gesture, in the other hand, his own Vice President Mike Pence, the Senate Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and House Republican Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy were absent from his departure and farewell event. What can this symbolize? What these acts and this absence tell us about Trump's legacy in the Republican Party?
Well, the first thing is he is in Florida. We have to ask, why is he in Florida? He could have elected to stay in Washington, D.C., live there, but he's persona non grata in Washington, D.C. He could not even go to his hometown of New York. He's persona non grata there. So we sort of built a bunker near his golf club, in which he himself, his family, and his closest collaborators are, according to reports that I read yesterday, are starting to work out plans, who knows, perhaps for another run in 2024. On the other hand, it must be very difficult for him because his closest supporters before the January 6th event, such as Mike Pence and others in the Republican Party, did not follow him to Florida, but rather attended the event today in Washington, D.C. So it's really hard to predict what he's going to do. But as far as I know, I don't think he's going to just let go. He is really driven by his own ego to try to undo the loss of the elections a couple of months ago, and he may be planning a comeback. And when I mention a comeback, one comes to mind as a possible ally is Mike Pompeo. I've noticed Mike Pompeo, his tweets over the last 2 weeks has been consistently, one after the other, touting the so-called successes that Pompeo and Trump had, for example, in the Middle East, trying to overthrow the government in Venezuela, which of course was not a success, the issue of Russia on Iran, etc. So he is sort of building, Pompeo, according to his Twitter account, has already started his campaign for 2024. But I think it's too early to say exactly how this chess game is going to take place between, on the one hand, the Trump supporters, especially his family's closest collaborators in Florida, and others who Trump may consider to be renegades. So we'll have to see how that works out.
I have a question for you because you were referring to Mike Pompeo, because I have this pronunciation thing. So the thing is, in this case, we know that in the last days of Trump's administration, they implemented new sanctions against Cuba, and also they had these sanctions against Venezuela. Do you think maybe this was a move to perpetuate this kind of foreign policy to make it harder for the Biden's administration to reverse it, and also to have a more friendly approach, let's say friendly approach, to Latin America and the progressive countries?
Well, the sad part of this is that, yes, he did, if we take one case at a time, Cuba and a bit later Venezuela, the sad case is that he did put Cuba back on the terrorist list in order to put the new administration in a bad position. However, the sad part of it is, I have to say, it's working. I saw a TV program on CNN a couple of days ago in which Fareed Zakaria, who is CNN host, and one could say is basically a informal spokesperson for the Democratic Party. And he had as a guest the main CNN strategist with regards to foreign policy. And dealing with the question of Cuba, Zakaria said, well, I can understand it will be very awkward for Biden to rescind the decision on the terrorist list and take Cuba off that list once again. And he has to ask his guest. And she said, yes, you're right, it will be awkward. And why do they say it's awkward? Because they can just imagine, they say, what happens? They take Cuba off the terrorist list, and then we can see Pompeo and Trump and others, perhaps in the Republican Party in Washington, D.C., criticizing Biden and his whole team for being soft on terrorists because they refuse to take Cuba off the terrorist list. So I'd like to clarify one thing. As I noticed in much of the media yesterday, there's been a wrong analysis with regards to Cuba, Pompeo's decision on Cuba. It is said that now it's going to be difficult for Biden because he has to go through the Congress and the State Department and all that. But that's not true. The fact is that Pompeo put Cuba on that list without any consultation at all, whether it's the State Department, the intelligence community, as they called, the members of Congress, no consultation at all. He just signed it. So I'm asking Biden, why don't you sign a proclamation today, January 20th, or tomorrow, January 21st, taking Cuba back off that list? There's no reason Cuba should be on that list. And if you use this as a pretext, well, we're afraid that we're in an awkward position. What will Pompeo think? What will Trump think? Well, what kind of an opposition is this to Pompeo and to Trump and his entourage when you cannot do a simple thing? By the stroke of a pen, Cuba goes back, is removed from that list. And this, of course, would open up a better relationship with Cuba. Now, I think there are a lot of associations in the United States, commercial solidarity groups, even 8 senators wrote a very powerful statement opposing Pompeo's action with regards to Cuba. So why can't the Biden administration take this example of 8 senators from their own party, all Democrats, and take Cuba off that list right away? I think that this cannot wait 1 second. It was one of the most cruel activities of Trump over the last 4 years. I'll give you one example. I spoke to some of my colleagues in Havana a couple of days ago, and I asked them, well, how will this affect Cuba? One person, an economist, told me, well, look, we are carrying out daily now over 12,000 tests in order to detect COVID-19. That's a lot, 12,000 per day. And he said, well, this costs money. And with the new measures taken by Pompeo with regards to being on a terrorist list, this will decrease the capacity of Cuba to have access to funds. By having this Cuba on that list, it means that Cuba, for example, cannot try to get loans from the International Monetary Funds or other international organizations. It will very sharply curb the very few economic relations that exist between the United States and Cuba. They will be diminished. And also other companies in other parts of the world, seeing Cuba on the terrorist list, this may be used as a pretext. Well, we cannot do any trade with Cuba. They are on the terrorist list, we do not want to be punished by the State Department. So this is a very serious thing. How can anyone in the American Congress not raise their voice with regards to that? And I noticed a very bad sign, I have to tell. I watched the entire nomination or confirmation meeting in the American Senate yesterday. Anthony Blinken, who is Biden's nominee for Secretary of State. They talked about a lot of countries. They talk, of course, about Venezuela. And the basic thing is, it's sad, but it is a bit funny. The Republican from that panel in that hearing said, well, I hope you're going to recognize Juan Guaido as a president of Venezuela. He said, yes, of course. And on Iran, he was asked, Blinken was asked, Do you consider Iran to be the most important terrorist threat in the world today? Blinken said, yes, I do. Do you think that Israel is a racist state? No, it is not. I can go on and on. In other words, whether it's Democrat, Republicans sitting on that Senate panel, all have come to the same basic conclusion of the bipartisan policy of the United States towards the rest of the world. Now, it's interesting to note as well that in that meeting, in that hearing yesterday, Cuba was mentioned by Mark Rubio, of course, only in the context of the so-called syndrome of attacks against supposedly Canadian and American envoys in Havana. And he asked, we have to get to the bottom of that. What is the cause? And Blinken simply said, yes, we have to get at the bottom of it. What is the cause? Accepting without hesitating 1 second that there is some kind of truth to the fact that Cuba or someone else was involved in these attacks. So he said, we're going to look into this carefully. In other words, it seems to me, I hope I'm wrong, but United States, the Biden administration, is just stalling on the issue of Cuba. In that hearing yesterday, anything, there was about 2-3 hours, I listened to the whole thing, any point could have been raised by the sitting senators and Anthony Blinken. No one, whether it's Blinken or none of the Democrats and Republicans in that Senate hearing, raised the issue of Cuba being put on the list of so-called of countries supposedly supporting terrorism. This is very worrisome. Is there something going on that is that they can agree not to discuss that in the Senate hearing dealing with foreign policy, which is such an important point? Is there some kind of a hidden agreement between the Republicans and the Democrats to not challenge Trump on that issue, and by just a stroke of a pen, taking Cuba back off the terrorism list? So this is very worrisome. I hope I'm wrong, but it looks to me that something's in the air to postpone any positive changes towards Cuba, aside from some secondary things, allowing money to go from Cuban Americans in Miami to Cubans in Cuba. But on a most important thing, such as the blockade and the terrorists, it looks like they're trying to stall and just with time allow that measure, which sharply inhibits, sharply damages even further the Cuban economy. So the answer is that people all over the world, governments all over the world, whether it's in the United States, Canada, trade union movements, have to insist now. Look, like a stroke of a pen, you could take Cuba off that list now and do it. I think this is what we have to do.